Welcome to We're the We in We the People. I'm Dr. Cynthia Newton, Chair of History, Politics, and Society and Associate Professor of Political Science at Wesley College in Dover, Delaware. I'll be hosting today's program entitled Political Parties and the Two-Party System in the U.S. Before we begin, there are a couple of things that you should know about the League of Women Voters, which is the organization producing this series. The League of Women Voters is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and as such, they do not support political candidates or particular political parties, but do take stances on some issues. After doing countless voter registration sessions and other events, we realized that a whole variety of people from all walks of life don't really know the basics of our federal, meaning national, state, local government, and how they work. And so our series hopefully will remedy some of this. You may have had a basic civics class and forgotten a lot of what you learned, or you may have never had one at all. And some of our league members could use a little brushing up on some of this information as well. So let's begin. This series is funded in part by a grant from Delaware Humanities. So most people, as we think about political parties, they're not really part of our daily life. You don't need it for your job, you don't need it for where you live, you don't even need it for where you sit. This is different for members of our legislature who it's pretty much all they think about. We mostly only think of them around election time or when they're covered in the news media. Now, if you listen to our news media and our political pundits, you'll hear that this is the most divided, most contentious period in history regarding political parties and politics. Now, while this is not true, it is certainly a divided era, there have been others that are just as contentious and divided in the past. So today, to give you a little bit more background, a little bit more understanding, I'm going to talk about a few terms and concepts just to make sure we're all on the same page. Talk a little bit about the framers and the Constitution and the foundations of political parties, a little bit more history there. Talk about what makes the U.S. a two-party system. How do we only have two major parties? Talk about those two major parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. A little bit about all the other parties out there, the third minor parties. And then just bring it all back together and talk about ways that we could see change and evolution in the future. So what are we actually talking about? A political party is a group that exists for the sole function of getting candidates elected to public office. And they do this by providing candidates with a platform and a label. A party platform, this platform that they're provided, is their list of stances and beliefs. If you think of it as a stage, each issue that they take a position on is a plank in that stage. And when it comes together, it forms a foundation for a candidate to stand on. And then their party identity is the label or the shorthand that they give a candidate. So when the candidate's standing on that platform and they have a D or an R or Democrat, Republican near them, you know from that identity what they loosely generally stand for. It's kind of a shorthand. Now, we also hear about partisans and partisanship. A partisan is merely someone who belongs to or adheres to a political party. And then partisanship is that act of exercising that belief, whether it's running for office, posting something online, or some other activity. Now, we haven't always had political parties in this country, but very nearly so. We haven't even had the same two always. If we go back to the Constitutional Convention, 1787, there were a lot of divides among the various delegates from the colonies, but a big one was among what were termed the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Now, the Federalists, these were people that as they were coming up with this structure of a new government, that they wanted to see a strong national government. The Anti-Federalists, as you can likely guess, wanted to see more power go to the states and not have quite so much power and strength at the national government. Now, intentionally, the framers did not include political parties in the Constitution. You won't find them anywhere. but they're now so integrated in our system that we couldn't imagine functioning without them. If we look to a couple of clues from the time period that even get into this specific area, one is Federalist paper number 10, which is one of my favorites. The Federalist Papers were a series of articles that appeared in New York papers in 1787 and 1788 to try to educate the public on aspects of the new government and to try to gain support. The Anti-Federalists had their series of papers as well, although they're not generally as well known and famous as the Federalist Papers. Now, number 10 was written by James Madison, the future president and former Secretary of State, and he warned about the danger of factions. And factions were these groups of people that came together within the government and had their own ideas or own agenda, and that worked to tear the government apart, and that this would affect the stability and function over time. And a lot of scholars over the past couple hundred years, and analyzing Madison's writings and such, would say that he is actually talking about political parties. Another place we can look is George Washington's farewell address after his second term as president. He was never a part of a political party, and he specifically warned against political parties and the dangers that they would pose to this new fledgling nation in disturbing the stability and structure of the new government. Yet, despite all these warnings, it is natural for human beings of a like mind to want to come together, share their ideas, work to promote them, and know that there's power in numbers. Another change we saw was in the 1790s, a new kind of campaigning started to emerge, where issues were actually tied to voter opinion, and this facilitated the growth of issue platforms, of candidates needing to have views on a variety of topics, and then actually seeing what voters wanted, needed, and supported. So from those original Federalist, Anti-Federalist designations, they morphed and evolved and split into what we know as the first seeds of political parties. And they become the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Now, the Federalists do eventually go away, largely an unstable, untenable, and despite recent popular resurgence, Alexander Hamilton was not exceptionally popular, and he was closely affiliated with the Federalist cause. And eventually, over time, the Democratic Republicans split into the Whigs and the Democrats. Now, the Democrats do stay around as a second party for a little while, but then they also become unstable and untenable in the long term. In the mid-1800s, we see the emergence of the anti-slavery Republican Party, and this is the foundation of the modern Republican Party. And briefly, in the early 20th century, the Progressive, or sometimes known as Bull Moose Party, breaks off from the Republicans, but again, that's unstable. So through all of these kind of shifts and evolution and schisms, etc., we end up with the Democrats and the Republicans, who are our two main parties and have been for many, many decades. So I'll talk a little bit more, before I talk about the Democrats and Republicans, about the U.S. as an actual two-party system, because then this will make you understand a little bit better the power and strength and influence they have. So our system does not prevent other parties from forming, but many elements within it inhibit the success and of third and minor parties and make us default to a two-party system. And in political science, this is known as Duverger's law. But getting out of those deep political science concepts, I'll explain what that means. So in this country, we have plurality elections, meaning that whoever gets the most votes wins. So this makes a lot of races very competitive in that you only need to get the most. So you spend more money, you need influence, you need name recognition. We also have single-member districts. This means that we only elect one person to represent a district. So there is a winner and a loser. So again, this facilitates name recognition and putting power, money, and resources toward the one or two candidates that you think might be successful. We certainly have the strength of the party identity and label. If you just put a D or an R for Democrat or Republican next to most candidates' names, people have a general idea of what they stand for. It's not always 100%, but at least you get an idea. Most election laws in this country are made at the state level. And states' legislatures, much like our national legislature, are dominated by the two main political parties. And so whichever party is in the majority, obviously they write the laws to help their candidates get elected and to make it so that others have a much more difficult time. Over time, a characteristic of the major parties is to absorb and take on new ideas that may emerge either in society or emerge as something strong in another movement or even a third party, so that they take in more ideas and have a much bigger umbrella to fit more and more people. As I mentioned, we do have the recognition of the Democratic and Republican parties, and so often people will hear, well, why would you want to vote for Party X, this third party? Because you're just throwing your vote away, because you know one of the Democrats or the Republicans is going to win anyway. The Democrats and the Republicans have a lot of money. And this money and this influence, they spend, again, solely for the purpose of moving forward their platform and their issues and getting their candidates elected. And the last part refers to something I mentioned at the very beginning, the organization of Congress. What political party you belong to does influence where you sit. If you are a member of Congress. It influences your office. It influences your job in terms of what committee assignments you're given, what special issues and tasks you get to work on, how much support you get. And so even if you are elected and you are a member of a party that's not the Democrats or the Republicans, well, you've got to, kind of find a way to hang out with one or the other and see which one aligns more closely with your views, because that's the only way you're going to get anything done. So let's talk a little bit more about our two major parties here in the U.S., the Democrats and the Republicans. As I mentioned, they're not always the same, have not always been the same, will not always be the same. They change over time as their positions, constituents change. For example, even with the Democrats and the Republicans, they've shifted substantially since the World War II era, and a lot in the 1960s and 70s. There's a whole variety of reasons. Certainly the end of the New Deal period affected the Democrats. The Civil Rights Movement affected both parties. The Democrats, in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement, started focusing a lot more on minority recruitment, particularly of African Americans, and this helped to change it. More women were coming into the workforce and being more visible in the public sphere. This affected the Democratic Party. On the Republican side, we saw the rise of the religious right, the emergence of the neoconservative movements, again, which have also shaped who is interested in these parties and what they stand for. Now, as I mentioned, they do have a lot of money, and elections are very, very expensive. It can cost, if you're running for the U.S. Senate, for example, in a larger state, it can cost you upwards of $60 million. So having a big name like the Democrats or Republicans behind you certainly helps. Now, let's look a little bit more at both of the parties. Now, we generally know for shorthand, I mentioned the D and the R, but they also have symbols. The Democrats are the donkey, the Republicans are the elephant. So even if you see those, again, you know what they stand for. That's pretty amazing branding and marketing of their images. Generally, we come to see that in the news media in particular, but also in a lot of conversation, the Democrats are referred to as liberals and Republicans are referred to as conservatives. And while there is some truth to that, not all liberals are Democrats and not all conservatives are Republicans. but again, it becomes part of the shorthand of understanding view of government and what the role of government is in people's lives and what they stand for. Now, I'll talk a little bit about their platforms, just to give you an idea of what the Democrats and the Republicans stand for. And every 4 years, when we have a presidential election, in the lead up to that, each of these major parties will have a national convention, and this is when they update, rewrite, and vote on their platform, and this will be what they stand for going forward for the next 4 years. So if you're looking on the Democratic side, things that they stand for: middle-class economic fairness and equality, voting rights, combating climate change, removing opportunity barriers, ensuring quality, affordable education, promoting health and safety for all, supporting the troops in the military, and the U.S. being a leader in the world. And you can actually find, particularly if you go to their websites or look at other materials, much more detail on each of those and various positions within them. If we look at the Republicans, by contrast, they talk about restoring the American dream, the importance of the rebirth of constitutional government, a focus on agriculture, energy, and the environment, a need for government reform at all levels, to promote great American families, healthcare, education, and criminal justice, and to see a resurgent America in the world. So you can see that those have some significant differences, and the language would appeal to some voters and some citizens more than others. Now, what about if neither of those works for you? What about if there are other things you believe in or other views of government? And there are a lot out there. Again, these have pretty wide umbrellas, but, a lot of people believe different things. So there you have third and minor parties. These come and go all the time. I already mentioned the Whig Party, the progressive bull moose. Now, while there is still a progressive party, it's not quite the one of the early 20th century. And these often have little electoral success, but they still form because, again, like-minded people coming together, power in numbers. But any success they generally have is at the state and local level. Now, that's not 100%, across the board and across history, but that's generally what we find to be true. There are two main types of minor and third parties that emerge. Issue-based. Now, these are generally focused around an issue, a particular thing that evolves in American society, a particular issue that comes up that a lot of people feel passionate about and want to make some change, whether it's getting laws passed or representing this issue at the national or state level. A really good example came up in the mayoral election in New York City a few years ago. Now, there was a gentleman who was very concerned about affordable housing in New York City. This is an issue, has been an issue for a long time, continues to be an issue. And so this guy, that was the focus of his issue party. And his issue his party is the rent is too damn high. That was his party, that was his issue. He didn't care about other things, focused solely on that. And again, these parties come and go. If affordable housing no longer becomes an issue, maybe he won't have a party anymore. The other type are ideological. These are parties that have a particular view of government, maybe how government should be structured, what the role of government should be in people's lives, what the role of citizens are. And these tend to last longer because these can be more enduring beliefs rather than an issue that comes and goes. And a couple of examples, the Communist Party or the Socialist Party. These are both parties that still exist in the U.S. The Democratic Socialists of America has actually been gaining strength in the U.S. And they have a particular view on what the role of government is, how much power government should have, and what its role to its citizens are. Now, our most enduring third and minor parties in this country, the Libertarian Party and the Green Party, actually do really a good job of blending these two, the ideological and the issue, and many argue that this is why they've had, a little longer lifespan than a lot of others. So I'll talk briefly about these just to give you some alternative examples to the Democrats and the Republicans. The Libertarian Party has been around since 1971. It's been the third biggest political party in the US since the 1980s, with roughly like 500,000 members or so, and seeks to reduce the size, influence, and cost of government, particularly at the federal level. Believes in strong civil liberties, and wants the government minimally involved in citizens' lives. So minimum regulation, much more free trade, open borders, those sorts of things. The Green Party, by contrast, formed in the 1980s and is the fourth biggest political party in the United States, and their focus is much more around equality, environmentalism, fostering a more participatory democracy, non-hierarchical leadership, diversity, and nonviolence. And so you could even see between those two that they're very different visions and ideas of what government and what our society should look like. Now, while these have a little bit of success, but not a huge amount, some of the same issues that make them not be so successful are, again, some of those same, I'll reiterate, that make our two-party system strong. Certainly the organization of Congress and finding your place there, party identity, money, the broad platforms, and the most significant is that most voters in this country are fairly moderate. Most people are not extreme to one side or the other. Again, despite what you may see in news media, most people are kind of middle of the road. And so the Democratic and Republican Party generally work well for most Americans, thus why they're the two biggest. So bringing this all back together, with all of the definitions, the information on our history, party identity, the two major parties, all of this, again, these will evolve and change over time. And as I'm talking to you now, with the Democrats and the Republicans, our two major parties, who knows if this will be the case in 10, 20, 50 years from now. But we will still likely only have two major parties in the US. And an example of societal change, something that changed in the platforms, is that in 2012, the Democratic Party for the first time included references to same-sex marriage. This again would have been something that was unthinkable for them 10, 20, or 30 years before, and represented a big movement that they either needed to embrace or that they would be damaged and other third or minor parties would gain more of a foothold that more represented these constituencies and these interests. So for other significant change to occur, or even for people to better understand and appreciate or work to change the role of political parties in American life, again, we need more voter education. I can never stress the idea of too much education, and this is a first step, at least even watching this and understanding this. Perhaps there will be a big citizen movement or some voter drive movement, etc., that would encourage more people to support something else or make changes. There might be another major divide or schism in one of our parties, such as happened to the Republicans in the past, or even what eventually doomed the Democratic Federalists, at least the Federalist wing of that. We would need to see a change in how Congress is organized. This is likely not coming anytime soon because of the strength and money and influence of the two major parties, but nonetheless, if that were changed, that would take some of the power and drive of the two parties. Or we would need to see change in state laws. And again, this would suffer some of the same influence, but a lot of citizen movements have had impacts at the state level, particularly as it regards redistricting and other issues that do ultimately affect this. So hopefully this gives you some introductory steps into the issue of political parties and the two-party system in the US, and hopefully inspires you to go out and look at a little bit more, or at least maybe to vote in an upcoming election. I thank you very much for your time.